This is Part 4, Chapters 29 to 41 of the Book Project 2025 Quick Review by Marko Vovk, available on Amazon. Project 2025 outlines a strategy to expand religious expression in public institutions, with a primary focus on schools. The plan advocates reintroducing prayer in public schools, allowing student-led prayer at events and moments of silence for reflection. It calls for protecting religious symbol displays in public spaces and incorporating more religious content into school curricula. The document emphasizes the protection of faith-based student clubs and the expansion of protections for teachers who express their faith in classrooms. It proposes mandatory training on religious liberty for school administrators and teachers. Project 2025 advocates for increased access to public funding for faith-based organizations that provide social services in educational settings. The plan calls for strengthening conscience protections for public employees objecting to practices on religious grounds. It suggests allowing more explicit celebration of religious holidays in schools and government institutions. Project 2025 proposes revising interpretations of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause to permit more religious expression in public institutions. Specific proposals include legislation protecting student-led prayer at school events and guidelines for teaching about religion in public schools. The plan recommends changes to the Equal Access Act enforcement and advocates for displaying the Ten Commandments in classrooms and government buildings. Critics argue that the religious biases of other religions are a form of religious bias. Project 2025 argues that these measures are necessary to protect religious liberty and restore the role of religion in public life. Project 2025 proposes significant reforms to the Federal Reserve and monetary policy, reducing its independence and increasing accountability. The plan advocates for a comprehensive audit of the Fed, encompassing its economic policy decisions. It suggests narrowing the dual mandate to focus on price stability and inflation control, while not explicitly calling for an immediate return to the gold standard. Project 2025 proposes exploring the option of commodity-backed currencies. The document criticizes low interest rate policies and quantitative easing and suggests a rules-based approach to setting rates. It recommends stripping the Fed of some regulatory powers over banks. It expresses skepticism about central bank digital currencies. Project 2025 calls for reassessing U.S. involvement in international monetary institutions and reducing contributions. The plan advocates for aggressively reducing the Fed's balance sheet and explores alternative monetary systems, including competitive currencies. Specific proposals include legislation for a full federal audit and creating a commission to study gold standard implementation. Project 2025 recommends appointing governors skeptical of activist monetary policy and supportive of rules-based approaches. These reforms aim to ensure monetary stability, reduce inflation, and limit government economic intervention. Critics argue these changes could increase volatility and limit crisis response capabilities. Additionally, they argue, what would be the federal response if banks were to go bankrupt? Implementation would likely face opposition from economists and financial industry leaders. The plan emphasizes gradual change to avoid market disruptions while reshaping U.S. monetary policy. Project 2025 outlines a comprehensive strategy to reform federal labor laws and union regulations, aiming to reduce union power and increase employer flexibility. The plan advocates for a national right-to-work law that prohibits mandatory union membership or dues payment as a condition of employment. It proposes changes to union election procedures, including shortening timeframes and requiring secret ballot elections for certification. The document suggests revising overtime rules to provide more flexibility for employers, increasing salary thresholds for eligibility. Project 2025 proposes narrowing the definition of joint employer to limit situations where multiple businesses are held jointly responsible for labor violations. It proposes more precise standards for classifying workers as independent contractors, benefiting gig economy companies. The plan emphasizes increasing financial reporting requirements for labor unions and restricting the use of union dues for political activities. Project 2025 proposes significant changes to the National Labor Relations Board, including the appointment of business-friendly members and limitations on its rule-making authority. It calls for limiting public sector union power by restricting collective bargaining rights for federal employees. Specific proposals include legislation requiring periodic recertification votes for unions and revisions to the Fair Labor Standards Act. The plan recommends changes to the NLRB's ambush election rule and advocates for the repeal of the Davis-Bacon Act. Project 2025 argues these reforms promote economic growth and protect individual worker rights. Project 2025 outlines a blueprint for reshaping the education system. The plan aims to dismantle the Department of Education, privatize student loans, and overhaul accreditation systems. It proposes breaking up the Department of Education and dispersing its functions across multiple agencies. Key aspects include eliminating Title I funding for low-income students and converting federal education funds to vouchers for private schools. The project seeks to scale back civil rights protections and end federal safeguards for LGBTQ+ students. The plan proposes removing diversity, equity, and inclusion requirements from federal regulations and legislation. It emphasizes bolstering workforce skills for those not pursuing four-year degrees rather than relying on traditional higher education subsidies. Project 2025 advocates for strengthening protections for homeschooling and expanding parental rights in education. It proposes prohibiting federal regulation of homeschooling and ensuring equal access to federal programs for homeschooled students. The document supports increased transparency in public school curricula and promotes school choice options. It suggests significant changes to special education rights and protections for student data privacy. Critics argue that these reforms could exacerbate educational inequality and erode protections for vulnerable students. Implementation would likely face opposition from teachers' unions and education advocacy groups. Additionally, there is no mention of trade industry jobs. Support the argument that it is necessary to protect families and enhance educational outcomes. While a limited government plan emphasizes swift implementation in a new administration's first year. Project 2025's Mandate for Leadership outlines a comprehensive plan to reform the civil service system, focusing on making it easier to dismiss federal employees. A key proposal is the reinstatement and expansion of Schedule F, which would reclassify a significant portion of the federal workforce as at-will employees. This change would facilitate the dismissal of employees in policy-making, policy determining, or policy advocating positions. The plan also proposes simplifying and expediting the process for removing federal employees by shortening the notice period for terminations and limiting the scope of the appeals process. Another significant component is the implementation of more rigorous performance evaluations to identify and remove underperforming employees. Project 2025 proposes extending the probationary period for new federal employees, providing more time to assess their performance before they receive full civil service protections. The document proposes reforming the Merit Systems Protection Board to limit its ability to overturn agency decisions on employee removals. The plan aims to reduce the influence of federal employee unions in matters related to employee discipline and removal. It emphasizes giving agency managers more authority to make hiring and firing decisions without extensive bureaucratic oversight. While maintaining protections for genuine whistleblowers, the document suggests reforms to prevent underperforming employees from abusing whistleblower protections. Project 2025 also proposes revising the performance improvement plan process to make it more efficient and less time-consuming for managers dealing with underperforming employees. The plan includes implementing more robust accountability measures for all federal employees, tying job security to performance and alignment with agency goals. These reforms are necessary to create a more efficient, responsive, and accountable federal workforce. The document argues that current civil service protections often shield incompetent or obstructionist employees, hindering the implementation of administrative policies. By addressing these issues, Project 2025 aims to ensure that the federal workforce is better equipped to serve the public and align with the administration's objectives. Project 2025 outlines an ambitious strategy to expand domestic mining and resource extraction with a focus on critical minerals. The plan aims to reduce regulatory barriers, streamline the permitting process, and prioritize domestic production over imports. Key aspects include regulatory reform, a comprehensive critical mineral strategy, and expanded access to federal lands for mineral exploration. The proposal calls for streamlining environmental reviews under the National Environmental Policy Act, revising the definition of waters of the United States, and limiting the use of the Endangered Species Act to restrict mining activities. It emphasizes the development of a national strategy to secure domestic sources of critical minerals and rare earth elements, which are essential for advanced technologies and defense. Project 2025 advocates for a one-stop shop permitting process with strict timelines and limited grounds for legal challenges. It proposes increased funding for research into efficient extraction technologies and support for domestic processing capacities. The plan also suggests strengthening partnerships with allies to secure critical mineral supply chains while reducing reliance on imports from potential adversaries. Economic incentives include tax breaks for companies investing in domestic mining and processing facilities, a strategic minerals reserve similar to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is proposed. Workforce development initiatives focus on supporting educational programs and streamlining immigration processes for skilled workers in the mining sector. Specific examples include reopening mining areas in Alaska's Bristol Bay region and creating a Critical Mineral Security Act to fast-track strategic resource projects. Establishing a National Strategic Minerals Agency to coordinate federal efforts is recommended. Critics argue the project has minimal mention of Indian reservation rights. Project 2025 argues these measures are necessary for national security, reducing foreign dependence, and promoting economic growth. The document stresses swift action, proposing many changes to be implemented within the first 180 days of a new administration. Project 2025 outlines a comprehensive strategy to reform the U.S. asylum system and refugee programs to reduce admissions. The plan emphasizes stricter eligibility criteria, expedited processing, and enhanced enforcement measures. Key aspects include asylum reform, refugee program overhaul, administrative changes, detention policies, international agreements, legal changes, border security, and public messaging. Asylum reform involves implementing a safe third country policy, which requires asylum seekers to apply for asylum in the first safe country they enter. It expands the use of expedited removal procedures for asylum seekers at the border and raises the credible fear standard to reduce the number of claims proceeding to full hearings. The plan also limits asylum eligibility for those who enter it legally. The refugee program overhaul proposes reducing the annual refugee admission cap and prioritizing refugees from specific regions or religious groups facing severe persecution. It includes more stringent vetting procedures for refugee applicants and gives preference to those likely to become economically self-sufficient. Administrative changes focus on restructuring the Asylum Officer Corps to emphasize fraud detection and enforcement. Increasing the number of immigration judges aims to expedite case processing, and implementing performance metrics for judges encourages faster case resolution. Detention policies include expanding detention capacity for asylum seekers during the adjudication process and ending the catch and release practice. The plan also implements a Remain in Mexico policy for asylum seekers awaiting hearings. International agreements involve negotiating with other countries to accept asylum seekers and refugees while pressuring them to improve their asylum systems. Proposed legal changes include narrowing the definition of asylum eligibility, amending laws to expedite the deportation of failed asylum seekers, and limiting judicial review of asylum decisions. Border security measures enhance physical infrastructure to deter illegal crossings and asylum claims. Increasing staffing and technology at ports of entry aims to improve screening. Public messaging campaigns in source countries aim to discourage unfounded asylum claims and emphasize the stringent nature of new policies. Specific examples include limiting asylum eligibility to cases of government persecution and excluding gang violence and domestic abuse as grounds for asylum. The plan proposes establishing regional processing centers outside the United States for asylum claims and implementing a point-based system for refugee admissions. prioritizing factors such as education and language skills. It advocates for DNA testing to verify family relationships in asylum and refugee cases. It proposes reinstating and expanding the Trump-era migrant protection protocols, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. Project 2025 argues that these measures are necessary to restore the integrity of the asylum system, reduce illegal immigration, and ensure that limited resources focus on the most deserving cases. The plan emphasizes swift implementation in the first year of a new administration. Project 2025 outlines a comprehensive strategy to enhance protections for religious organizations participating in government contracting and grant programs. The plan emphasizes preserving religious liberty while allowing faith-based organizations to compete for federal funding on an equal footing with secular entities. Key aspects include reinforcing the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, in federal contracting and grant-making processes, ensuring that religious organizations can maintain their spiritual identity and mission while receiving federal funds. The proposal revises non-discrimination policies to allow religious organizations to consider religious beliefs in hiring decisions, even when receiving federal funds. It protects the right of faith-based organizations to operate by their religious tenets. Policies will ensure religious organizations are not excluded from federal programs solely based on their spiritual character, removing barriers that have historically disadvantaged faith-based organizations in the grant application process. The plan expands religious exemptions in federal contracts and grants to protect organizations from requirements conflicting with their religious beliefs. It clarifies and broadens the scope of activities protected under religious exemptions. Faith-based initiatives will be revitalized and expanded across federal agencies, with dedicated offices established within these agencies to support faith-based and community organizations that access federal programs. Conscience protections will be strengthened for religious organizations and individuals involved in government-funded programs, ensuring that participation in government contracts does not require organizations to compromise their religious beliefs. The grant application process will be simplified to make it more accessible to smaller religious organizations, and technical assistance will be provided to help them navigate federal grant requirements. Regulatory reform will involve reviewing and revising regulations that may unduly burden religious organizations or infringe on their religious liberty. New rules will be implemented to codify protections for religious organizations in federal contracting and grant making. The document provides specific examples, including proposing legislation similar to the Child Welfare Provider Inclusion Act to protect faith-based adoption and foster care agencies from discrimination based on their religious beliefs. It also suggests creating a religious liberty task force within the Department of Justice to oversee the implementation of religious freedom protections across federal agencies. Changes to the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or OFCCP, are recommended to ensure religious organizations can maintain faith-based hiring practices while holding federal contracts. The plan advocates for expanding school choice programs that include religious schools, such as vouchers and education savings accounts. It also proposes to reinstate and expand the Mexico City policy to prohibit federal funding for international organizations that provide or promote abortion services. Project 2025 argues these measures are necessary to protect religious liberty and ensure faith-based organizations can fully participate in government programs without compromising their spiritual identity. The plan emphasizes swift implementation of these changes, particularly in the new administration's first year. Project 2025 outlines a comprehensive strategy to reform antitrust laws and enforcement, with a focus on addressing issues related to large technology companies. The plan proposes updating the Sherman Act, Clayton Act, and Federal Trade Commission Act to address modern market dynamics in the digital economy. It aims to expand the definition of anti-competitive behavior to include data monopolization and platform dominance. The proposal calls for revising merger guidelines to scrutinize the acquisitions of large tech companies more closely, particularly those involving potential competitors or data-rich startups. It suggests implementing stricter standards for vertical mergers in the tech sector. To enhance enforcement capabilities, the plan recommends increasing funding for the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division and the Federal Trade Commission. This strategy would incorporate data accumulation and privacy concerns into antitrust analyses. The plan addresses data portability and interoperability requirements, as well as potential remedies in antitrust cases. It explores regulations to ensure large tech platforms maintain neutrality and do not unfairly exploit their products or services. Project 2025 proposes reevaluating the consumer welfare standard to consider factors beyond price effects such as innovation, quality, and consumer choice. It encourages state-level antitrust enforcement actions against tech companies and facilitates coordination between federal and state authorities. The plan emphasizes strengthening international cooperation regarding antitrust enforcement with global tech companies. It aims to align U.S. antitrust approaches with those of other major economies. Specific tech practices such as self-preferencing, predatory pricing, and exclusionary conduct in digital markets would face increased scrutiny. The proposed legislation would prohibit tech platforms from favoring their products in search results or app stores. The plan recommends creating a digital markets unit within the Federal Trade Commission to focus on tech-specific antitrust issues. It also recommends changes to merger review processes to examine the potential long-term impacts of tech acquisitions more closely. Project 2025 argues these reforms are necessary to address the unique challenges large tech companies pose and ensure fair competition in the digital age. Project 2025 outlines a strategy to revise federal policies on transgender rights and gender identity issues, aiming to reverse protections implemented in recent years. The plan proposes redefining sex in federal law to refer exclusively to biological sex at birth, eliminating references to gender identity and regulations. Title IX revisions would reinstate policies requiring schools to treat students according to their biological sex for sports, housing, and facility use. Healthcare policies would remove gender identity as a protected category, allowing providers to deny transition-related care based on religious objections. The plan advocates reinstating restrictions on transgender individuals serving in the military and prohibiting federal funds for transition-related care for service members. Federal employment protections would remove gender identity and sexual orientation from non-discrimination policies. Identity document changes would be restricted, requiring federal agencies to use biological sex for official purposes. Housing and homelessness services would be revised to allow sex-segregated shelters to admit individuals based on biological sex rather than gender identity. Prison policies would house incarcerated individuals according to their biological sex. Data collection practices would focus on biological sex, eliminating options for non-binary or transgender identities. Funding restrictions would prohibit federal support for organizations providing services related to gender transition for minors. Specific proposals include legislation to ban gender-affirming care for minors and creating a task force to review federal regulations. The plan recommends changes to the Equality Act to exclude gender identity from protected categories and to reinstate rules allowing healthcare providers to refuse transition-related care based on religious beliefs. Critics argue that people with altered chromosomes without genitalia or who have both sets are not mentioned. Project 2025 argues these measures protect traditional values and ensure fairness in sex-segregated spaces. Project 2025 outlines critical reforms to the federal budget process, emphasizing fiscal responsibility and reduced government spending. The plan advocates for a balanced budget amendment, requiring the government to match revenues with expenditures, except during emergencies. Statutory spending caps would limit federal spending growth to a fixed percentage of GDP or the inflation rate. Zero-based budgeting requires agencies to justify budget requests annually rather than building on previous budgets. The plan calls for streamlining the congressional budget resolution process and implementing stricter submission deadlines. Significant reforms to entitlement programs such as Social Security and Medicare aim to ensure long-term fiscal sustainability. Enhanced rescission authority with the President's power to propose spending cuts after budget passage with expedited congressional consideration. Multi-year budgeting processes would encourage long-term fiscal planning and require regular projections. Debt ceiling reforms aim to enhance their effectiveness as a budgetary constraint, including automatic spending cuts if the debt ceiling is reached. The plan proposes a Fiscal Responsibility Act to codify spending caps and enhance budget enforcement mechanisms. A bipartisan commission would review and propose reforms to entitlement programs. Changes to the Congressional Budget Act would require the scoring of long-term fiscal impacts for all legislation. A constitutional amendment would mandate a supermajority vote to raise taxes. Project 2025 argues these reforms address growing debt and deficit issues, ensure fiscal sustainability, and promote economic growth. The plan emphasizes the swift implementation of change in a new administration's first year, while aiming for fiscal responsibility. The proposed reforms present potential challenges in striking a balance between economic stability and stringent budgetary controls. Project 2025 outlines an aggressive strategy to combat illegal immigration, emphasizing interior enforcement and crackdowns on sanctuary cities. The plan calls for increased ICE staffing, expanded cooperation between federal and local law enforcement agencies, and nationwide implementation of E-Verify. It proposes withholding federal funds from jurisdictions, limiting cooperation with immigration authorities, and authorizing legal action against jurisdictions that are considered sanctuary cities. Visa overstay enforcement would be strengthened through improved tracking systems, increased penalties, and enhanced collaboration with transportation providers. Worksite enforcement would intensify with increased audits and stricter penalties for employers who hire unauthorized workers. The plan advocates expanding expedited removal procedures and deploying advanced surveillance technology along borders and ports of entry. Legal reforms aim to close perceived loopholes in asylum and immigration laws while streamlining the court system. Detention capacity would expand to end-catch and release practices with increased coordination for deportations and immigration enforcement. Benefits enforcement would tighten verification processes and eligibility requirements for public programs. Specific proposals include consolidating immigration agencies, increasing fees for immigrants, creating specialized ICE units for overstay enforcement, and expanding grounds for deportation. Project 2025 argues these measures are necessary to restore law, protect national security, and preserve American jobs. The plan emphasizes swift action, particularly in a new administration's first year, reflecting a comprehensive approach to reshaping U.S. immigration policy. The Heritage Foundation's conservative blueprint aims to reshape the U.S. federal government. This initiative provides a roadmap for the president to implement sweeping changes across various sectors. At its core, the plan seeks to reduce government size and scope, aligning it with conservative principles. It proposes a significant restructuring of federal agencies, including the dismantling of some departments and the reorganization of others. Economic policy advocates for tax cuts and reduced spending. The proposal streamlines regulations to foster business growth and suggests reforms to entitlement programs that will reduce their long-term fiscal impact. Immigration reforms require stricter border enforcement, including the completion of the wall and increased deportations. The system would prioritize merit-based entry and reduce chain migration. The Department of Education is facing significant challenges, including specific responsibilities such as transferring employees and terminating others. Local control and school choice initiatives are emphasized. Social policy takes a conservative stance, proposing restrictions on abortion and contraceptive access, potentially enforcing the Contraceptive Equity Act. It suggests rolling back LGBTQ+ protections and eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in federal agencies. Environmental proposals reduce regulations on fossil fuel production and scale back climate change initiatives. Agencies like the EPA would be reformed to prioritize economic considerations alongside ecological protection. National security recommendations include abolishing DEI programs within the Pentagon and reinstating service members who were discharged for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine. The military's approach to climate change as a security threat would be reevaluated. Justice system changes suggest that partisan control of the Department of Justice and the FBI may be in place, potentially allowing these agencies to be used for the pursuit of conservative political goals. Stricter law enforcement measures and the use of capital punishment are promoted. Healthcare proposals include repealing or modifying the Affordable Care Act and implementing market-based reforms. Public health agencies would see changes in focus and priorities. Technological and communications policy reforms target agencies like the FCC and FTC, altering their regulatory approach to align with conservative principles. Foreign policy emphasizes an America First stance, reevaluating international agreements and organizations. A more assertive approach to geopolitical rivals is proposed. Financial sector reforms advocate changes to institutions like the Federal Reserve and alterations to regulations that promote economic growth and its stability. Election integrity measures propose enhanced voter identification requirements and electoral process reforms aligning with conservative principles. This initiative has sparked intense debate. Supporters view it necessary to realign government with conservative principles and address perceived overreach in progressive policies. They argue it would promote economic growth, enhance security, and protect traditional values. Critics see it as an extreme proposal that could reverse progress on civil rights, environmental protection, and social welfare. Some view it as a threat to democratic norms and institutions. The conservative perspective is generally favorable. They see it as a comprehensive strategy to restore limited government, promote economic freedom, and protect traditional values. They view it as a corrective to perceived overreach and erosion of conservative principles. Opponents, primarily from progressive and moderate circles, express significant concern. They argue the changes would dramatically alter the federal government's role, potentially harming vulnerable populations and undermining essential protections. It would cost billions to make this project work, and questions remain about whether it would save money through its implementation. The project does not include other religious groups, potentially eliminating many supporters. Additionally, many would not accept the boundaries between church and state. However, many aspects of the project could reduce government spending and increase efficiency.